we had a brief look at town planning and planning requirements. We looked at the process of that. We're not going to go too much into that process and the online application at all, because we have a whole unit coming later in the year that will be looking completely at that. We'll go through the absolute planning process and all the documentation that's involved. But however, at this early stage and at the beginning of a project, it is really important that you are aware of the planning clauses that will apply to your development. And that's because you're about to design something. And when you're about to design something, you need to know the parameters that you have to design to. So we do need to look at the planning scheme in terms of what clauses might apply to our particular project. So the way this planning scheme works, it divides all of the areas of Darwin, and that is a map of Darwin. This is Darwin Harbour here. We've got Mandora over this side, and we've got the CBD here, and this is East Point, the mouth of the harbour, and everything else. Palmerston sits here, and northern suburbs right up the top there. This is a zoning map, and why is the zoning map important? Because all of the land in our building zone has been zoned, and the zone tells us what's permittable in each of those areas. Not only does it tell us what's permittable, but it also tells us the clauses in the planning scheme that will apply to that particular development. So if we zoom in, and I'm not sure this is going to...
Hold the control button.
I don't have a mouse at all, though. I'm over here still.
That's it.
There we go.
If you hold the control button and you scroll, it will zoom.
I'm going to try and get in a bit further. This is a PDF now.
Wherever the cursor is, that's where it will go.
Yeah, it's the zoning in. So,
if we can find Rapid Creek Road.
Yeah.
Road there. Airport. And then Mills, Trowler, and
it's here. It's here.
That's the vine.
there somewhere, I reckon.
You got it, yeah. So we're going to go. Oh, that pan doesn't like me.
It's a big map.
Try this guy here.
It'd be good if the key you follow the
Yeah, I know what you mean. Where am I? I'm over that side. Okay. So we found our Rapid Creek Road here. And our site is here, isn't it? Oh, that guy in there, I think. Pretty sure. Yeah. So last week we looked at one way to find out what our planning zone was. Does anyone remember the other way to find it, as opposed to the zoning map? What other maps did we look at last week?
Somebody said it.
NR map, yeah, so that interactive map where we could punch in the address of the site and it brought us into the site, and along the bottom we could hit the information button and it would give us the area of the site and a few other things, but it also gave us the planning zone. I find that the easiest way to look up my planning zones, but this is the actual zone map for Darwin. So this shows us an overview of the whole area. And so the big letters that we can see here, SD, represent one of the zones of the planning scheme, single dwelling. So we know that this site that we're looking at on Rapid Creek Road is zoned for single dwelling, SD.
I think the key's to the right-hand side, isn't it? We can see all the other
Yeah.
parts of the zones.
I'll try and come down on this side. So you can see lots of other zones there. So we've got these yellow areas, which are CP, community purpose, normally.
The university is zoned CP.
Yeah. And we'll just have a look at this key down here on the bottom.
It's on the right, I think, on the side.
on the right. All the way.
All the way. I might just come out a little bit.
Yes, it might be right.
So we can see a few things on here. We can see the administrative boundaries, so it gives us a key. Not that they're very legible. Aircraft noise exposure, so obviously we'll be looking out for that around the airport. But mostly what we're looking at is this key over here that gives us all the different colours. Can you guys read that?
Feel free to bring it up on your own computers as well.
Yeah, you can type it in.
Google NT zoning map.
That's probably a bit better there now.
Oh, there you go.
So our zones are looking at, we'll look at the residential ones first. So SD, single dwelling, MD, multiple dwelling, MR, medium density, and HR, high density. So they're referring to your apartment buildings and where the density really does increase. CV, caravan park, and CL, community living. So community living, an example of that might be where the Salvation Army have residential accommodation that's pretty permanent. You know, people are actually residing there for long periods of time, as opposed to a hotel that you might stay in for 1 or 2 or a week if you're lucky. Nice. The other zones then we can look at in the rural area, we expect to see A for agriculture, R for rural, or L, rural living, and R, rural residential. So 3 types of zones there that are still connected with residential in the rural area, and H for horticulture. And then the commercial side, we've got C for commercial, service commercial, SC, TC, tourist commercial, and CB, central business. So obviously we expect to find that in the city centre. Yes, Paul?
SC, which we're looking at there, single dwelling.
Yeah.
So that includes small units, small blocks of flats.
That would probably be under MD. It depends how many residential.
So 2 doors up from there is, we call them 2 units joined together.
Yeah, yeah, like a duplex.
Duplex,
yeah.
A couple of doors up the
Yeah, duplex would normally fall under MD. The zone would be MD for duplex.
Well, that's why I was wondering whether it's actually a duplex or whether it's just a house.
Just a house that looks like that. Yeah, yeah. Then recreational, we have the public open space, the green, and the organised recreational, which is more your sporting fields and, you know, something that's manicured and laid out and landscaped for a particular purpose. The infrastructure side of things, the roads, so we have the main road, proposed road. You'll often see that one out in the rural area. The utility and the railway lines. Industry then, we've got DV development, we've got light industry and general industry are the 2 main ones for industry. And then we've got the others, so we've got the community purpose, which CDU is community purpose land, so sort of self-explanatory. And then there is an explanation for all of these within the planning scheme, which we'll have a look at now in a minute too. Township, future development, restricted development are all under other, and then we've got specific use, which there's a couple of specific use areas around. The one I probably know of mostly is East Arm, so specifically used for industry that supports our gas and oil industry out of East Arm. Sorry, do you want to say something?
You just have to watch out too, because that specific use, that's where a developer gets given a parcel of land and they have certain guidelines they have to abide by when they divide up the land. They have to make sure they have enough community service space or access ways or bus stops or what have you. There's usually quite a few rules that the developer has to abide by before you even buy the block of land, and it gets given a special number. So in the planning scheme, it's right down the bottom of the document, and it often starts with the abbreviation SD, so you just have to keep an eye out. See how it's kind of a grey colour? So if the resolution on your screen isn't great, or if the glare on your screen is quite high, you can easily make the mistake of seeing SD and a number and think, oh, that's single dwelling. And I have made that mistake, and it didn't take me long to figure it out because it didn't make any sense when I looked up the code, but it was an easy mistake to make because they both say SD. So special development and then a number refers to this specific use clause, and you have to go further down. There's actually a separate category in the planning scheme for special developments or special use. So It's usually with regards to a new parcel of land that's being subdivided, and it gets given a whole bunch of rules sort of in line with or outside of the planning scheme.
A few others there, just the conservation, water management and heritage. Then we'll see down here we've got Commonwealth land, which we'll often see on the map, and it is no planning scheme controls. So something like our airport is on Commonwealth land, and so if you were doing a development over on the airport site, you wouldn't have to apply for planning to the NT government because it doesn't fall under their jurisdiction. And then restricted rural residential has this dash, which we've never had to deal with, but they're all zones. So if we look at the document itself then, the actual planning scheme.
And Sandra's downloaded it just now.
Yeah.
So it's a recent version. If ever you're looking at the planning scheme, always go to the live document.
So I would encourage you all just to download a copy of the planning scheme on your desktops this afternoon, so you'll be able to flick through it yourself. You can open it then in Adobe. So I don't really like using the live one off the website. If you use it in Adobe, you can use your bookmarks and all that to flick through it. It's quite a large document, so that's always helpful. Speaking of my bookmarks, where are they?
Just see the little arrow on the right to get rid of that toolbar.
Yeah.
On the right, that palette, get rid of that and give you some more space. You know the little right-hand arrow down a bit, in the middle, down.
Oh,
Yeah,
this
that
little
one,
guy.
that'll close that palette off. And then I think view. Read mode, maybe? No? No? Press escape and I'll change it.
You can get them over here and they can just flick through the different chapters. We'll just have a look through here first anyway. So,
Pardon?
sorry? So this is the Northern Territory Planning Scheme. So you can download it off the website. Can you tell me what the name of that was? NT Government, and it's Building and Development Planning Scheme.
Anytime you're looking for anything, just always include NT Gov
Yeah.
with your search.
NT Gov Planning Scheme will bring you straight to it. Really want my...
No, it's not.
Not loading? Just give everyone a minute to do that. I want to see, can I get my bookmarks up?
So if you're on the main page, the NT Planning Scheme, there'll be introduction as the first link. The actual document's embedded on that page. You can either get it in small chunks, and section 4 is the one that you want, or you can get the whole thing all in one go.
Anyone know how I would get my bookmarks up on this document? I can't seem to. Anyway, we'll keep going with or without them. Have a second, yeah. So the first part of the planning scheme there just sets out the preliminaries of it. The second part looks at the different regions, and then the third part we're getting into zones. And zones we really want to talk about. So for this application, we are, bringing a house. We talked about this last week, this project that we looked at. So we're bringing an existing elevated house. It's transportable and movable, so we're bringing it to this site on Rapid Creek Road, and we're going to position the house on that site. And we want to check with the planning scheme to see, do we need to apply for a planning permit? And the only way to do that is the first step is to identify the zone, which we've just done, the single dwelling zone. Pretty happy about that. I would be much more devastated if I realised that we were trying to move it to an industrial zone or, other types of zones that wouldn't permit residential use. So, fantastic. No.
It's not bad, but...
It's a bit better. Weird, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's on my computer.
Where would you like to go?
So we go to zones. Let's have a look at the definition for SD. That's just there, 5.1. And so go straight to it. So each zone has the letters associated with it, and each zone up front will have an explanation of what an SD zone is. Of course, our computer's working really well with us here. And
yeah, I usually go straight to the website. I confess I don't navigate it this way. So
okay.
I'm not much
of
of an assistant for you today at all, am I? That's the actual clauses, isn't it? So I'll go to the zones. What section was it again?
3. It's 5.2.
Oh, 5.2.
Yeah.
I'm catching on. Whoops, went too far. No? Did you say 5.2?
That looks like
Sorry. Everything.
part 5.2. Oh, 3.
3.2.
3.2.
That's
It's
how it
5.1. Yeah.
See, terrific. Whoop, there we go. There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
So SD zone. The primary purpose of SD zone is to provide single dwellings on individual lots. Non-residential uses or development should be limited to those which predominantly serve the local neighbourhood and do not have any detrimental effect on the residential amenity. So, for example, I live on a street and there's a doctor's surgery on my street which is run out of one of the houses there. So that's a permitted use in an SD zone because, you know, it's a service for the local neighbourhood and it doesn't have a detrimental effect on the residential amenity. Now, if I had a welder's yard a couple of houses up from me, I wouldn't be so happy about it because, you know, obviously that's a lot of heavier industrial use and obviously it's going to create some noise and smells and odours and the like, so I wouldn't really want that. So really that clause is just in there to allow some home-based industries to occur in residential areas. So when we go to the zoning table then, in Zone SD, we have to define the use for our building. So if we look at some of the uses here, the very first one we just spoke about earlier, the abattoir, and it goes on, you know, childcare. So where we see the X's, those are
Prohibited.
Prohibited, yes. I thought the P was the P is permitted. That always confuses me. The X is prohibited and the P is permitted. So we can see what so this table is the same table for every zone, but just where the X's and P's and D's are located is slightly different. So if we look a licensed club, for instance, is a prohibited use in SD. So our use is going to be single dwelling. It's right down the bottom there. So that is what our house is. It's a single dwelling. Now, we also can see there that multiple dwellings, this is kind of what Paul said, is a prohibited use. It's got an X. So if you decide you're going to build 2 units on your single dwelling zone site, that's prohibited. They're just not going to allow it. So when we look at this table and we see prohibited uses, I would go so far as to say, don't bother applying. It's a prohibited use. The Development Assessment Services are not allowed to recommend approval of a prohibited use. That goes against the planning scheme, so they will not recommend to the Development Consent Authority to give you approval for that. And what you will be asked to do is rezone the development as well as applying for a development application permit. So this sign, you will be doing both. You would have a concurrent application, you would have a proposed planning scheme amendment and a redevelopment zone of the site, and you would be doing a proposed development permit as well. So you'll be doing a lot of things and you'll be trying to change the planning scheme. So the zoning map that we looked at, that's part of the planning scheme, and that's been adopted by the NT government. So any changes to that is an amendment to the planning scheme. So I hope that gives you some sort of realization of the complexity of just changing a zone. So clients will come to you and they will ask you to do, you know, the difficult tasks, and it's very much that you need to be aware that that's a very long, lengthy and probably expensive process to do, and there's no guarantee of its success. So I would probably recommend to your client, if they want to build a single dwelling, then they buy an SD site. They don't go or they want to do a multiple dwelling, they don't go and buy an SD site. They go and find a site that's already zoned MD. That's the simplest way to do it.
I did have a client that had an SD block of land that he wanted to build 2 units on, and did get it rezoned to MD. Those 30 people that Sandra was talking about, those same group showed up at that same meeting. At the time, it was before the planning scheme changed dependent units to be independent units. So this granny flat phenomenon that you weren't supposed to rent out to an individual person was being rented out, because the cost of rent was very high here and the availability of rental accommodation was very poor. So it was right at that time that this client was petitioning to have this SD block switched to MD, and he was successful on that argument. I think perhaps if it was the present day, you probably wouldn't be successful. So it does change. It was a very large block. It was a corner block, and access to 2 sides was really easy, and we weren't impeding on anybody's access. There were lots of things in his favour that made this particular block suitable for rezoning to MD and then developing with 2 units. So a traditional single access block may not necessarily have been successful, and the timing just happened to be really good. But the group that Sandra referenced earlier this morning that often petitions against developments, one of the main instigators of that group was his neighbour on that lot. So it was a really tough argument. But because the government was under a lot of pressure at the time to create accommodation and to build density in certain urban areas, and this was one of those places by the soccer fields at Bagot Road and McMillan's, I can't think now.
Coconut Grove.
Yeah, just off at Coconut Grove, yeah. That's a key place where they'd like to build density, so it was permitted, but I don't know necessarily that it would be approved today.
So always the simplest way forward will be to comply with the planning scheme. You know, they're absolutely the best outcomes for your clients is if they are compliant.
Is there a middle ground? There was something in the papers 6 months ago about Larrakia being a dual.
Yeah, there's been lots of talk about a dual occupancy site in the last couple of years. I believe it's not going ahead now, but it did have lots of legs and was running a couple of years ago. The planning scheme certainly hasn't been amended to allow this, but what the intention of that was that, you know, again, going back a couple of years when accommodation in Darwin was short of demand, they looked at the older suburbs of the ones around the city, the Parap and Stewart Park, Larrakia, and a lot of those, because they're the original residential areas of Darwin, and a lot of the lots in those areas are in excess of 800 square metres. When we look at the new suburbs now being developed, the Zucolis and even Muirhead, you know, we're looking between 300 and 600 square metres. It's, you know, quite a dramatic reduction from our traditional 800 to 1,000 square metre lot sizes. And so what they were looking at doing was that instead of developing new suburbs and getting this urban sprawl and the city just keeps growing out, and of course all those people have to get in their cars and drive in and out, and that puts greater demand on our road systems. And you know, certainly in other countries we're really looking at putting more dense populations closer to the CBDs, so we don't have that much pressure on roads and transport networks for people moving around. So they looked at that in Darwin and they said, well, we've got all these sites that really you could have 2 houses on. You could divide, you know, 1,000 square metres and still have 500 square metres for each individual house. And so there's been a lot of talk about permitting that to happen. It comes with lots of issues though, because each of those individual lots only has 1 connection for water and 1 connection for electricity. So if you have 1,000 square metres and you've got a house up the front and you want to do a battle axe to a house at the back, how do you bring services into that without crossing over another existing lot, or how do you know, is it just get too expensive if you have to relocate all the services? So services are a huge part to having two dwellings on the same lot. So there's been lots of talk about that, and it's all to do with putting more houses onto our existing suburbs rather than having growing new suburbs.
I'm on a lot of 3, which I'm pretty sure isn't right in Larrakia, and I'm also on my next door neighbour's service. It's not service that's coming to the lot. So the 2 houses.
What?
Yeah.
I'm sure I want to hear this. La la la.
I was affected, and so was the person over the fence, but the 2 houses that I'm attached to.
Oh no. Oh no.
So
And I'm pretty sure that's not supposed to be 3.
No. I just,
probably not.
yeah. If an inspector came along and said, make it all proper, you'd have to either rezone, like change the boundaries and move the boundary to incorporate the right buildings and change hands with money. So somebody would have to agree to buy somebody else out, and then you'd have to rearrange all the services and get it all signed off again.
So what could happen is that your neighbour owns the piece of land that your electricity and water travel through, and then it could decide to cut you off. So you don't have any services. You don't actually own the land, and
No,
it's
there's
their
nothing
land.
you can do about it.
There's nothing you can do about it. So anytime you're looking at a site for yourself or anyone else, you want to make sure that the services for any one lot should always come from the public utility. So they should be metered from the road. They should never cross somebody else's land to get to your site. That's really essential part of having a building and a home or any building that is fully serviced, that the services are part of that building and part of that lot. It's not going across somebody else's. That's highly illegal to go across somebody else's land.
Disaster.
It does. Absolutely it does. And so do you get billed from Power Water? Do you have your meter?
Yeah, I get direct bills, whoever, Origin or whatever.
Yeah, okay, yeah, your provider, yeah.
Not for water.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, well, your landlord would normally do that. Yeah, because if you're the other thing that people run into issues with when they're renting a granny flat is that it doesn't have its own bill system because it's not connected directly to the mains utility. So you can perhaps, if you can find the correct wiring and it's all on its own circuit, you could perhaps sub-meter, but often that's not the case either. And also, if you have a duplex, so you've got two dwellings side by side, the services to those two dwellings would be completely separate. They're not part of the same system. You can imagine if they were that electrician could be working on your neighbour's house one day and you come home and turn the power back on and you electrocute him. So this can happen if say for instance a normal single dwelling is divided in two and rented as two different components. The services are not separate. And that's something very much to look out for. Services should always be separate to separate dwelling.
Would that allow you to build a single dwelling on a multiple dwelling?
Yes, they do. Yes, that's actually permitted. Yes. Yeah, you can go the other way. Now, why you would want to do that? Probably if you had lots of money and wanted to build a rather large house. Like the land value, because it's valued on the fact that you can put 2 or 3 units on there, is much greater than if you can just put one single dwelling on there. So, yeah. Paul?
I've just pulled up the zoning map,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a single dwelling, and it's not marked down as that individual lot that I was saying about. It's got 2 dwellings on the one lot, and it's owned by the housing district.
Oh, really?
And I do remember them digging the road up to redo the water service, because it went to run down the opposite side of the road, and they put in 2 metres. And I know a lot of people kicked up fuss, but somebody put out a pamphlet and everybody's been home, neighbourhood, saying it's been passed, there's nothing you can do about it.
Dear.
But it's actually owned by the Housing Commission, and the rumour was that when the people moved out of the next Housing Commission house, they were going to bulldoze that and turn it into a 3-bedroom plus a 1-bedroom thing, so it's got a carport, it's over that 50 square metres for a granny flat.
Mhm.
It's bigger than that because it's got its own carport
Mm.
and everything at the back of the allotment.
Yeah.
So
Carport's not included in the 50 square metres.
No.
if it's got tin roof though,
No.
Only the
it's
habitable
internal.
space has got to be 50 square metres. Yeah, it includes the walls, but it's only the living spaces like the bedrooms
so
and...
to have done that, they would have had to have that single dwelling changed to a multi-dwelling.
I don't know what they would have done there. I really
It
don't
sounds a
know the
bit
history of that.
weird.
It does
Mm.
sound a bit strange. So what you can do, and what you've been talking about there with the 50 square metres, is a dependent unit, or which they're now independent units, which you can build on a single dwelling site. So you can have the existing house or build a new house, and then you can have an independent unit, but it cannot be greater than 50 square metres. And again, it is connected to the services from the main dwelling on that house.
Yeah, well,
They're not separate services.
they've actually taken it separately because when I came back, I went and had a look in the yard and it stayed vacant for
Yeah, right.
nearly a year.
Yeah,
And so they got separate power lines, separate water.
yeah.
meters.
Generally, Power Water won't connect you. Power Water would object to that straight away themselves as well, because they don't want to have two power connections on one lot number. They won't permit that either. So, you run into all sorts of, issues because you're not doing things the correct way. So, I suppose this is something I thought about all last weekend. I said, got all these lovely new enthusiastic students. And I said, but they all keep asking me questions about how to get around all the regulations. I really hope that when they leave here after a year that they will be the people upholding all the regulations and saying, this is the way it has to be, and there's a good reason for all of this, and yeah, exactly. So that's what I hope to get you to at the end of the year. So let's look at the single dwelling then. So we've got a P, yay, it's permitted. So see down the bottom here, we've got permitted, self-assessable, discretionary and prohibited. Please don't ask me what self-assessable is, because I don't know. I've never used it. I've never seen anyone else use it. Don't know why it's even in there. So permitted, discretionary. Discretionary is exactly what the word discretionary means.
Home-based visitor accommodation, a little bit further up the page, is that can point to
Self-assessable.
like granny flats?
No, that's an independent unit, is a granny flat. So home-based visitor accommodation.
Yeah, I think it is more like a B&B type thing. Yeah.
It's just the kid thing
Yeah, it must be, because accommodation,
allowing some recognition that may be a possibility.
I'm wondering if that's in response to Airbnb.
Well, you've got an independent unit here, which we just spoke about. So that's the one up to 50 square metres, and that's permitted as long as you comply with these clauses.
Yeah. Who knows?
Yeah. So single dwelling, clause numbers, and I'll advise you write these down. So permitted, but you do need to comply with clause 6.5.1, also clause 7.1, also clause 7.3, and also clause 7.5. And we go further down into the scheme to look at those. Now, let's write those down and let me scroll.
Everybody get those down?
Yeah.
Where's the bit in this where it tells you what all the different things mean, like home-based? There's a part, but I don't know where it is.
Oh, the definition.
Yeah. No, that's all just
Normally when I'm doing this, I have to work on the project.
Right.
I bring the drawings up on the screen. I raise them right up and put them in front of it, and then I draw over.
Oh, okay. I'm going to let you
Do
do
another
that.
go?
No.
I'm just going to put the bottom in and put it right up.
Definitions 1.9. Trying to find. So, in the definitions section here, it tells us what all the different words mean. So what was that one you said, Josh? It was
Home-based visitor accommodation.
Home.
7.10.1.
So they're alphabetical. So we'll go to home-based childcare. Home-based visiting accommodation means temporary accommodation provided on the premises of a dwelling by the resident of that dwelling as a commercial enterprise for persons away from the normal place of residence, but does not include a hostel. So B&B. I think it would be more of a B&B. So under the definitions, of course, when you need to, because often the use of, especially when we get into commercial uses, the use isn't, completely equal to one of the defined uses in the planning scheme. There's often, some controversy there. With dwelling houses, it's quite clear often what we are going to be looking at, but sometimes later on it will get a bit more blurred. So single dwelling, what is a single dwelling? According to the planning scheme, means a building containing one dwelling only. Fairly straightforward. Oh, a transportable, that's the purpose of it is going to be a dwelling. It's going to be a single dwelling, yeah. So in part 5, I believe. I'm really lost without my bookmarks because I can usually just click straight to the clauses I want.
F, I must admit. The control F, and then type in what you want and press enter.
Yeah.
Yes, that will get you there.
So part 4 here, it starts looking at the clauses. So the first clause that we had there was 6.5, was it?
6.5.1.
6.5.1 gives us a heading here, parking requirements. And so we're going to go and find that one in the body of the scheme. 410. Got it. Yeah. Can't really see anywhere to search here. Where would you search?
Did you want to?
I've got a little.
Yeah, I'm
I'll show you.
trying to get to where I need to get.
And then
Oh, yeah.
6.5.1.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
How did you get that to come up?
Oh, goodness knows. So control F gets you that.
Gets you that
And then I
finding.
just press enter on the
Perfect.
buttons, yeah.
The parking requirements, this is the clause, 6.5.1. Please remember when we're reading these clauses, they apply to every single building type. So the planning scheme is a document that applies, it's a one-stop shop for all building types. It's not just about housing. So we know that we've got a zone SD, we know that we're getting a single dwelling, and we know that we must comply with clause 6.5.1. Parking requirements. The purpose of this clause is to ensure that sufficient off-street parking is constructed to a standard and conveniently located and is provided to service the proposed use of a site. So it could be for any type of building, but that's what you have to provide. Subject to clause 6.5.2, if a use or development specified in column 1 of the table, so there's obviously a table coming up soon, to this clause is proposed, the number of car parking spaces rounded up to the next whole number. So sometimes you have to do a car parking calculation for commercial buildings. However, for single dwellings, it just gives us a number of car parks, so we won't have to do the calculation or do the rounding up. We'll come to that later in the year when we do a planning application for a commercial building. Required for that use of development is to be calculated in accordance with the formula. Number 3, if a proposed use or development which is not listed in the table to this clause requires consent, the number of car parking spaces required for that use or development is to be determined by the consent authority. So this is where I'm saying to you, sometimes you get your permit and it will have a condition on it saying how many car parking spaces you have to provide. And number 4 there, a car parking area is to be designed in accordance with the clause 6.5.3, except where the car parking is required in association with a single dwelling and an independent unit. So that number 4 is really talking about the size of the car park itself. But it's telling us actually that we don't need to comply with that for single dwelling or an independent unit. So this is our table to clause 6.5.1, and we're going to look for our use over here. So our use is not an independent unit. A little bit. Single dwelling. Column 2, minimum number of car spaces required. Simple answer, 2. So do you see the one, let's look at supporting accommodation here, for example. It's not always a simple answer. It doesn't always tell you exactly how many car parks you need. Supporting accommodation is 1 for every 4 beds, plus 4 for every 100 square metres of net floor area used for administration purposes. So that's where you have to start getting into car park calculations for other types of buildings. But for single dwelling, keep it simple, it's 2 car park spaces that you are required. Column 3 looks at the minimum number of car parking spaces required within zone CB, so central business, in Darwin. Why do you think we have a different column for that?
Some things like, is it because of ostrich-code?
Yeah. Because in a CBD, if we try not to think about it on a Darwin level, if I think about it on a Melbourne level, lots of people live in the CBD in Melbourne don't own a car. They'll never have a requirement for a car space because they've got great facilities with public transport and they're walkable to a lot of their work, hopefully, and recreational activities. They can walk around, and there's other forms of transport. And so this is why we often see a separate column for really densely built up urban areas for car parking requirements. However, in Darwin, we haven't reduced the number that we need to provide even in the CBD. So all those apartments in the CBD still require 2. Yeah.
So the more denser, the number's going to have to be lesser.
You would hope the number would go down, that there would be less car parks required. Yeah. So the answer to our first clause there in our planning scheme is that one of our design parameters will be that we have to provide car parking for two cars for a single dwelling. So we go back to our slide.
Can I just interrupt you? I'm sort of going to tag in with Sandra here. So if we want to think about the planning scheme in relationship to our project, we have an opportunity now to take the proposed site drawing that you have, and if you don't have it in front of you, just grab it out of your filing cabinet.
Do we have some spare ones for the guys over here last year?
Yep, if anybody needs a spare one, you're welcome to ask. What we're going to do is amend this drawing now. So this will be the first opportunity that you've had to start working on this project. This is the first regulation this project has to comply with. I've just handed out some paperwork to our newcomers. Don't panic too much, but have a look through those documents. You'll find a piece of paper just like that. It's a copy of the proposed site with a suggestion of where the dwelling should go and a suggestion of where the driveway might like to go. So the client and the design brief came up with this rough sketch early on, and we can apply these planning schemes. Typically, the planning scheme requirements apply mostly to the site plan, so that's why we've got this one first. But there might be some elements of the other sketch plans you've got that might be implicated. But what we want to try and get a bit of an idea of is how we're going to comply with the different planning scheme clauses as we go. I'll just let everybody get their goods and shackles. Yep. Who can remember about a week ago when the brief was given out, the client had a preference to where they wanted the car park spaces to sit? Very good memories. Underneath. Now, if you have them with you, the sketch plans of the building that they're purchasing and relocating to this site is just a long rectangular building raised up on stumps, on stilts, on columns. So we're putting it up quite high, and there's room underneath. And it's wide enough to fit 2 cars. How wide is our building? Just off the top of our heads. We don't have any dimensions on this sketch.
6.375.
About 6.3 metres. And if you've already
Maybe 20.
gone to the trouble of sizing up a garage or a carport, 6 metres is a good width, isn't it? So I've got a small car, I drive a little economical Suzuki, and even with both doors open, it doesn't even get halfway wide enough for that. But a four-wheel drive, a big Land Cruiser or a Prado or something typical of Darwin drivers, 6 metres is good if you've got two big cars like that. And they're quite tall as well, so we might want to make a little note on here that the height needs to be tall enough. Now, the planning scheme is interested in height. It's not interested specifically in car park heights, but it is interested in overall heights, which we'll come to later. But what I'm perhaps suggesting is that you might like to make a mark on your drawings to show where the two car parks are going to go, and you could number them if you wanted to.
So also on the ground floor there, you've got your laundry and your,
Yeah, so you can't take up the whole thing. You can't drive all the way through. The brief said they wanted a laundry, which will probably be in the middle, and then an entertaining area, which is probably going to be at the back. And then they talked about having a solid wall. So that's all sort of design brief stuff. We don't have to worry too much about that for the planning scheme, but the planning scheme definitely wants two car park spaces. And you could even put a little note here somewhere saying, clause 6.5.1, two car park spaces. And they need to be allowed. And as Sandra mentioned, they have to be on the site. You can't say, oh, I'll just park on the street. No, that's not how it works. So when we're doing our checklist and we're checking the regulations against our design sketches, we'll be making some notes on the checklist to say whether it's compliant or not, and we might make some amendments or some notations on our sketch plans to make sure that it gets taken care of.
It's only available space for two cars.
Yeah, just space.
So
No rule that says it has to be top.
included, parking back.
Anything you want. Yep. There's just got to be room. There's quite a few new developments that are actually selling the carports. What do they call them? Neck to knee, nose to toes. Because they're quite narrow blocks. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? So we've just jumped into applying the rule at the same time as knowing the rule. We're applying it to the actual project. All right, I'm going to get this out of the way. Pardon? 6.5.1?
6.5.1.
Yeah. You'll be reciting them in your sleep, Paul. All right. Now we can go back to the next clause. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Awesome.
What was the number of the next clause, guys? Do we call them out?
6.3?
6.3.
3. 4? Nah.
Building setback?
7.1, 7.2.
Not 6.3? 7.3.
No.
Oh, now I don't know. I'm losing
Let's
it.
go back to the table.
Yep. 6.5.1, 7.1 is it next?
7.1.
Ah, there you go. Where did I even get 6.3 out of?
You had 6.5.3, that's what you were talking about, wasn't it?
Yeah, and then 7.1 is next.
Let's
Quite
just
right.
have a look before we move on. 6.5.3.
No, it's not 3.
No, there is another part
just
to
the
that
part.
one.
Yeah,
It's
you're
just-
right.
And I just wanted to show that this is not going to work.
Keep pressing enter and it'll take you to all the different versions of 6.3. Press enter again. Oh, that's a good diagram. Yeah, keep going. More. Yeah. Oh, it's going to take you through every single one of them.
Every time
That's boring.
6.3 comes up. Oh,
Previous. Yeah, it was almost. Yeah, there it is.
Okay. So 6.3, so we'll just keep looking at that. So we had 6.5.1, 6.5.2 looks at reduction in car parking requirements. It's not going to apply to us on the single dwelling. So the consent authority may approve use or development with fewer car parking spaces than required by clause 6.5.1 if it is satisfied that the reduction is appropriate for the use of development or having considered all the following matters. So the zoning of the land, the provision of car parking spaces in the vicinity of the land, availability of public transport in the vicinity, or the uses development relates to heritage place. So, like I was saying before, they can't, the Development Consent Authority could tell you, you know, you don't need so many car parking spaces. However, be warned that if you are granted planning permission and you have a reduction in car parking spaces, yeah, it was 5.1. One.
Yeah, that was multi, that was the only problem.
So it referred to the,
No.
yeah. So when we were in this very first bit,
6.5.4 does provide if your lot is bigger than 600 square metres.
It was just that what was on the board before was the table for multi, that's all. So when we copied them down, we had 6.5.1, 6.5.4.
6.5.4 is not, yeah.
no, we can go back to the table. No, no, the ones are, it's for single dwelling, it's 6.5.1, 7.1, 7.3, and 7.5. Those are the ones for a single dwelling in an SD zone. Yeah. So you're right, the 6.3 isn't in there, but I'm just looking at it because it's to do with car parking as well, and it's just all it's telling you about is how the car parking space should be designed, basically.
It gives a good overview of what a park space size should be, so 2.5 metres wide and 5.5 metres deep. It's just a good approximation of what a decent sized car space ought to look like. So if I was drafting this up and I wanted to draw those boxes to scale, I would make them 2.5 metres wide and 5.5 metres deep.
Mm-hmm. That's what your car park space needs to be, the dimensions of it. There are also a few other little clauses in the planning scheme, so if you start doing other buildings other than single dwellings, which I don't want to get too much into today, we will get back to this on the commercial buildings, but you know, if you've got a row of cars, you have to leave 2 metres on the end. You can't be within 12 metres or 9 metres of the end of the building with your angled car park, so there's lots of other things to consider when you're designing the car park layout. But we'll get back to that in the commercial buildings. It doesn't quite apply today, as I said. It's the 6.5.1. So we're going to go now to 7.1. I'm just going to scroll to because it's easier.
Residential density and height limitations.
Sorry, what was that heading again? Do you want to read that one out?
Residential density and height limitations.
Yes. So 7.1, residential density and height limitations. So you just notice in the planning scheme too, so anytime the planning scheme has been amended, there's also a note down the side here to tell you when those amendments were added. So the purpose of this clause is to ensure that residential development is of a density compatible with the existing and planned provision of reticulated services and community facilities which service the area. Consistent with the land capability having regard to relevant characteristics, including but not limited to drainage, slope, seasonal inundation, landforms or soil characteristics, heritage constraints or noise from aircraft operations. So basically they want to tell you the density, so in other words how many houses per square metre of land, and what can be provided in a certain area. So again, I'm going to go back to the services, the reticulated services and community facilities. Earlier we talked about those older suburbs and how there was a proposal to have dual occupancy on the lots. I think a lot of the roadblocks that are happening to that proposal are because, let's say for instance, the suburb of Parap, it only has water pipes which are so big, I don't know what the diameter of the water pipes are, and for instance it'll only have substations for the electricity supply which are so big. They've decided that, I think that if we double the amount of houses in that street, all of those services then have to be upgraded to supply twice the amount of houses. So, you know, services are a huge consideration yet again. So the first part A there, looks at the services and community facilities. Community facilities can mean parks and schools, You know, obviously if you double the population of a suburb, is your school now big enough to house all those extra children that you're going to bring into an area? So all of these things have to be considered by the town planners. And of course the land capability, so drainage and all of the other things that are mentioned there. The maximum number of dwellings that may be constructed on a site is to be determined in accordance with tables A, B, C, D, E, as the case requires to this clause. And 3, the consent authority may consent to a development that is not in accordance with subclause 2 if it satisfies compliance in other aspects of this planning scheme, indicates that the density of the development is appropriate having regard to the purpose of the clause as set out in subclause 1. So we start going around in circles a little bit with the planning scheme. So one part starts referring you to another part and all the rest of it. But let's keep working through, because I often find the tables are easier to work with than the actual upfront statements that it makes. Multiple dwellings may be developed on a lot in zones H, horticulture, and A are agriculture, provided that there will be no more than 2 dwellings on the lot. So a lot of this doesn't apply to us in our current application. However, the table does. So we're looking for our zone. So zone on this side of the column here. We found our SD. The dwelling density that applies is 1 single dwelling per lot and may include an independent unit, which we've already discussed what both of those things are. So is everybody happy with that? We've got a single dwelling zone. We're allowed to have 1 single dwelling there, and you know, maybe sometime in the future we'll have an independent unit as well. But not right now.
Site plan, clause 7.1, one-time single dwelling permitted. There's more to clause 7.1, but that's just a term.
So we're just going to look at that bit to do with single dwellings today. We won't go into the rest of it. Now we're on to the next clause, which is 7.3. Oh, sorry, did you want to?
The height.
Oh, sorry.
Height limitation. 7.1.2.
7.1.2, the height, residential height limitations. So it's important when you look at a clause that says 7.1 that you don't do what I did and just read 7.1.1. You have to read 7.1.2 as well. So residential height limitations. The purpose of this clause is to ensure that the residential development is of a height that is compatible with the adjoining or nearby existing development. Does not unduly overlook adjoining properties. The height of any point of a residential building is to be measured from the ground level vertically below that point, and includes the height of a mound specifically provided or made to elevate the building. So you can't just come in on a flat site and decide you're going to build a hill and then measure from the top of the hill. If you've provided a mound specifically for the purpose of elevating the building, then the natural ground level is the original ground level that site was before you brought in the extra earth for the mound that you built to try and outdo the planning scheme.
So it is measured parallel to natural ground, though if you do have a sloped site, that the measurement that we'll find in the table will be following natural ground. So it's not directly in one point, it's in every point, if you like. But if it's a flat block of land, it's irrelevant.
Subject clause 6.2, the height of residential buildings may be constructed on a site, is to be determined in accordance with the table. A residential building in zone MR that abuts land in zone SD is not to exceed a height of 3 stories. So again, this is talking about zones MR, which doesn't concern us today. We're only looking for SD, but just for your knowledge, zone MR multi-residential. If you've got that right beside next door to your house and it abuts your SD zone land, then they're not allowed to build a height that exceeds 3 stories right beside you, or 4 stories if it, in any other circumstance, 4 stories. I thought 4 stories was including the car park, wasn't it? I think.
What planning determines as a story is different to everybody else.
So you can't build an 8-story apartment building right next to a single dwelling, basically.
So the stories, that there's a maximum height, isn't it? That can be 3 stories.
If the stories are included, you'll see when we get there.
So not to
Yeah.
confuse it, not in the single dwelling it can't be 3 stories.
No.
This is only if you have an MR site and you want to build an apartment building on it. But if you
Yeah,
can...
but if we're in single dwelling,
Mhm.
can you get 3 stories like a carport and bottom? That's only 2 stories.
We're about to get
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yep.
Then this is referring to if you abut land in zone SD. We'll come back to that again. That's really for multiple residential. It's not for single dwelling. The consent authority must not consent to a development that is not in accordance with the subclause. So, you know, it's telling them they can't allow that to happen. It's not discretionary. So here's our zone, our table to clause 7.1.2.
Can I ask a question on that last statement, Sandra?
Yeah.
Which implies, doesn't say, you know, the Darwin City Council must not consent to the consenting authority.
Mhm.
Is that because there's a similarity between these planning schemes nationally?
There is a similarity, yeah.
It sounds just a bit generic.
It is the NT planning scheme. It is absolutely developed for the NT region only, but that's a big region. And yes, they are sort of similar nationally as well. No, really what that sentence is telling it is that they have no discretion. The consent authority themselves have no discretion. If it is outside of that, it is just not allowed. You know, because you know there are some decisions that they can make that are discretionary, but this is not one of them. They cannot permit an 8-story apartment building right beside a single dwelling. Not permitted, ever. Not going to be allowed.
As much about corruption as...
I'd say about overlooking and shade and
Mhm.
that land value
discretionary.
and yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Put your hand out.
Yeah.
And
When you
that's
get a
why
big developer
this is
coming in,
not
yeah.
about council.
Yeah. So the table to clause, like yet again, I think the table is much more informative as that upfront piece. So if we look at the table to clause 7.1.2, and it's going to tell us the permitted height that we can have of our single dwelling. And so on the zone side, we're looking for SD. Up here it is, SD, and for single dwellings in other zones, because some other zones permit single dwellings, we can have the number of stories. This is answer to your question, Paul. Maximum number of stories, 2. Maximum dwelling height above ground level, 8.5 metres from the ground up.
So that means I can't put an underground car park
And does it
in,
say
or
that?
a 2-story house.
Would you want to put an underground car park in because it'll fill up with water?
Well, if you lived on a slope, cut into the mountain, that's just theoretical.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
This is above ground.
Yeah.
Above ground level, yeah. So if you're digging out, you're not actually above ground level. So if you're still under the 8.5, it is a story though.
Yeah,
Yes.
because part of it will be extruding out of the ground.
Mhm.
The back part will be in the ground because it's into a foot space.
Mhm.
But the 2 stories above, so when you're looking at it, you'll see 2.5 stories,
Mhm.
but from the slope,
Yeah. You know.
it's 2 stories.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what I was alluding to.
In cases like that, the only way to get an answer is to make the application. Make the application. Or go and talk to the town planners and see what they would think about that. I did work on a site similar to that in Larrakia, where actually and it was excavated a long time ago, I think in the 50s or 60s. The ground level is at one height and the site is now way down here with a big retaining wall, and this is ground level now, the new ground level, and there's a 2-story house built on that. But the owner wanted to build an independent unit. The independent unit was being built over an existing garage, and it was, if you measured it from the new ground level, the excavated ground level, it was over the 8.5. But if you measured from the original ground level of that site, which I had great difficulty proving because they dug it out in the 60s, it's the original natural ground level, it wasn't over the 8.5 in that. So we actually won that argument.
Yeah, because I've actually seen a building like I was talking about, and I
Yeah.
just wondered,
Yeah, no, there's a few, especially around Larrakia where you've got down the hill there to Cullen Bay. It's quite there's quite a few like that around there. Yeah. So definitely go and talk to the planners and see for that. This is exactly where the planning scheme doesn't cover every single specific site. It's a general rule that we have to apply.
So I'm just going to tag off of what Sandra was saying about height. We have this transverse section view in our manual drawing, and it has some original heights noted on it. See here we've got NGL, which is an abbreviation for natural ground level. Now if this is proposed, what they're suggesting is that you would start building where natural ground level is, not build it up or cut it back. And then the original building was 2.2 metres high to the underside of the beam here. This beam running through, it's probably more of a bearer than a beam, but we'll just go with that. Then there's looks like 300 millimetres in between the underside of that bearer and the FFL, or finished floor level. There's 300 millimetres there. And then they're proposing it was 2.7, I believe, 2,700 there, correct me if I'm wrong. 2,700 for there, underneath to the ceiling height up the top. So there's some proposed heights already ready to go. But what I'm perhaps suggesting is we could perhaps adjust some of these. Now we can't change from here to here because that's what we're buying. That's what's going to arrive. But this part under here isn't coming. That's for us to decide. So perhaps what I'm suggesting is that within the overall height of 8.5 metres, we could perhaps have a bit of room to move here, where 2.2 metres isn't very high for a typical caravan, well, for the entertainment area and things. I don't suppose you'll have fans in the carport area, but no. You might. They can sit up underneath a little bit, but even still you want some clearance. So fan heights is a good one, and also just big cars, caravans, trailers, boats, four-wheel drive, things like that.
Roller door needs the extra height. Four-wheel drive is 2.5.
Yeah.
You've got to have 3 metre opening to have the roller
Yeah, it'll be open to keep the breezes in this instance, but you're absolutely right. There needs to be somewhere for the door to go when it's all rolled up, doesn't it? Yeah. So I'm proposing a 3 metre height here. What do you think?
Yep.
Three is plain higher.
It's only to the ceiling, isn't it? It's not to the top.
To the underside of the bearer.
That's it.
For the clearance.
Yeah, no, for the, because this that ceiling level down there.
This one has to stay the way it is, because that's the bit you're buying.
So you only get, when you're measuring it, it's only to the underside of the ceiling.
No.
Ceiling level.
No, what?
No,
The 8.5.
No, the 8.5 is to the uppermost point, yeah.
Okay.
But your habitable spaces are a maximum of 7.1 metres. And no living here, no attic living in the cyclone conditions of Darwin. Too hot and too scary in a nasty storm. So there's about 1.5 metres there. Is it 7.1 or just 7? Just 7, isn't it? What do you think? 3 metres?
Yep.
So change your drawings. 3. 3 is plenty. I was going to say 2.5. I was being generous with 3. But what we have to make sure of is that it'll still fit within the limits. Yeah, so you change that to 3 metres, I think. So if we've got 3 metres, and then we've got 300 for just structure, and then we've got 2,700 for wall height, we just need to know what this distance is here, don't we? To find out what the overall height is.
Should be on the original plan.
It's not typically added on the original plan. That pitch height will be on there, so the actual pitch, the 12 degrees, will be on there, and the ceiling height will be on there, but the overall height you're not always going to get because it's typically as a result of the construction process. It can't be absolutely known perfect. We can have a pretty good go. We know what the ceiling height is, we know what the wall height is, we know what the materials are that we're going to use to make the truss, and we know what the battens and the roof sheeting is, but in the end, to the millimetre is asking a lot, so perhaps a few will just leave it off. The 7?
Yeah, 7 metres.
This 7 metres?
Yeah.
It's one of the clauses in the planning scheme, so it'll say overall height a maximum of 8.5 metres and no habitable space above 7.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want me to flick it back?
How is it, sorry,
I'm not saying that that's
Oh, yeah,
7
yeah.
metres. I'm
Okay.
just saying don't
Yeah,
live above
that's
7 metres.
that's
Yeah,
that's
no, because it doesn't add up. It's close, but yeah. 1.5 metres is basically where they're just saying between the ceiling height and the roof, and most pitches work out to be about 1.5 metres in section height. Yeah. So just to give it away, this is about 740 millimetres. I worked it out with some trigonometry in the past, so I'm just going to give you the answer. That's the height difference between the ceiling level and the ridge.
So we're going to add that up. .74 metres. Could have gone 3.2, yeah, what can you do? Coulda, shoulda, woulda. 3 is plenty. You don't want to get it too tall because then it's not stable and you have to put more cross bracing in and then you can't drive in and it's all a big hassle. 3 metres is pretty good. And you're going to have to buy new stairs, remember that?
Yeah, I've got all new stairs. None of that's coming. This whole section. Don't get much of that. Does anybody have any questions about that? Pardon?
No.
A ramp, yeah. We'd have to start in Palmerston to get there on time. So that's the planning scheme applied to the drawing. Now it's not the only drawing where you can see the height. The elevations have a similar diagram on them as well, similar levels on the left-hand side, so amend those as well. Just remember you want consistency across your drawings, so anytime you change one, look for other instances where you can amend the drawings as well. There's a longitudinal section, may well have some levels on the left. Anything that shows the heights. No levels, but you could perhaps add one for the 3 metre undercroft. I better have afternoon tea. Pardon? So the elevations have got the levels on them as well, so fix those up so they match correctly as well. Pardon? Say again. No, that's you. Just those hand-drawn ones. Just this one and the elevation. I'll bring up the elevation for you. The 2 pages will be plenty. Oops, that was quick. There it is. So there's some levels on the left on the elevation. So change that 2.2 to 3 metres. Don't worry about the overall.
For the overall, that's enough to have just done that quick calculation to know that you're going to be compliant with the planning scheme. Even if it's, you know, a couple of 100 mil out, we're still well underneath the 8.5 metres maximum height requirement.
I do know of a couple of submissions that have been compliant in seeking a waiver for that. It's pretty unusual and they didn't break it by very much. And it wasn't for the entire building. It's quite sympathetic to the design, sympathetic to the zone. It was in Cullen Bay. It was a slope site like I was talking about where the 8.5 metre line ran parallel with the land and they had this big red line on the drawing to show where it cut through and a little bit of the elevation popped out and they said, can we please have a waiver, and it was granted. Still had to go through the whole process, but it was okay.
You can't have technically a building overhanging cliff.
You can, but that's a whole nother set of issues. Yeah.
You would most likely get a waiver for that as well. You know, if you're
that's more about engineering and safety than planning. Yeah. And the expense of building it like that.
If a little bit of problem sale recently that had a building that was county coded like a workshop right on the boundaries in the 5 setback rules and stuff. If one, for example, wanted to rebuild that house with a new house to be coded to the current building standard, did that other building get triggered in any way, or you don't touch it?
Yeah, I think it's okay if you don't touch it. If it was built to code at the time, then it should be okay. They would have sought a waiver at the time and that would still be compliant. It's when you change something in the structure that it triggers the whole new set of regulations.
And if you're applying for planning for, say for instance, there was a single dwelling on that site, separate to the shed at the back, and if you're going to demolish that single dwelling and build a whole new single dwelling, when you draw the drawings for the site plan for that new dwelling, you're going to have to show the existing shed with no setbacks within the site plan. So you're literally going to be telling the planners what is there.
Yeah.
They may pick up on it. They may ask the questions. They may ask, was it compliant in the first place?
There was a moratorium for a while, but it's over now.
Yeah.
So there might come a call in.
Well, it's not that actually considering.
No.
It's just hypothetical.
Yeah. If you're ever buying property like that and there's existing structures on it, you definitely want to get what's called a building status report, and that will tell you what is compliant on the site and what's not compliant.
Have afternoon tea?
Yeah, we'll have a break. Ask you about something. I have another student. Oh, wait, stop this.
Is it better with the lights off? Nice, isn't it? It's quite good. The other option is to have the lights on and the blinds closed. So we'll try this today.